Like so many of us, I've been playing a fair bit of Helldivers 2 lately. Much of it with my boys, and it's been a blast.
My leg is broken.
It's a brew commander. Well, just shoot it and it'll die.
Shoot it and it will die.
Shoot it and it'll be a pacifist.
Blood for the blood god.
It's chaotic, high intensity, and just full of hilarious moments. So what is it about the design choices that they've made that help create a game which is just so damn fun? Well, let's take a look at some of those choices. Let's start with the core loop. The core loop is the flow of actions that players take while playing a game, and it's just easier to draw it out. So we have the mission. That's where people do the action, the kinetic stuff. They then get a reward based on their objectives. There's also a bunch of destroyer upgrades that they get in here. That reward, then they take that back to the destroyer. They can select those upgrades and those rewards there. This equals some amount of increase in power. They then select the mission that they want to accomplish, often scaled based on difficulty. Then they go in and kill bugs. The difficulty then informs what kind of upgrades they can get in these missions, which then they go out. The objectives that they complete here again inform what kind of reward that they get, and then so on and so on and so on. Yeah, that's the loop. It's kind of cool, right? Well, let's take these things and talk about each one a little bit and what I've noticed in each one. Let's start with the missions. Let's start with how they've procedurally generated the mission spaces, because this structure is the wrapper for all of the other mission mechanics that we'll talk about. They have this combination of really clear primary and secondary objectives. The secondaries are optional. And then these fuzzy points of interests combined with a timer that allow players to feel this deep sense of agency and accomplishment, kind of no matter how long you play for or how much players complete during the mission. To start with, every mission has a primary objective, which is really identifiable. You select this at the select screen. These objectives also then lend themselves, they have different types of play. So like destroying eggs is very different to launching an ICBM. So as a player, you kind of get to choose what you want to engage in, the kind of activity that you want to play in. These missions are they're always really clear on the map, those objectives, and they're required in order to extract from the play space. Then there are the optional secondary objectives that I think you can always see on the mission select screen. Honestly, I'm not sure. Let me know in the comments below if you can or can't always see them. But these are the secondary ones. These are, when you complete these, you earn a bonus for completing them end of the mission, but they're not required. There's just, there's the 5-star method that they have that allows you to complete extra and thereby earn extra requisition. Then there's also these fuzzy bonus locations. They're scattered across the map. They're these points of interest that occasionally have rewards, things like samples, which are then used to upgrade your destroyer. Sometimes they have medals, which are used to unlock things on the kind of the battle pass. And occasionally they have the super credits. The super credits are actually a premium currency that typically people would use real money to purchase. The way that these things are combined then result in really compelling exploration. The reason being is that you always feel like there's one more thing to go to, yet you're under this constant pressure from the bugs or whatever the enemy is, and the timer, in order to get out. So you always feel like there's maybe something you left behind, but you do feel this huge sense of agency and reward every time that you go to one of these random POIs. You always feel like there's one more thing to find. This has really helped with the way that they procedurally generate the maps. If it was the same map every single time, you just end up knowing where all those things were. On top of this, there's the timer. It adds to this feeling of pressure, so you don't feel like you can just endlessly wander. Your mission rewards are also tied to your major accomplishments. You can exit whenever you want and still feel like you've accomplished something, and that's just fine. Interestingly, they even give you a little bit of a reward for fast completion time of a mission. It kind of lessens the sting of not going along and doing all of those other objectives. Okay, so let's get into the way that they handle death and respawn. Whereas Tarkov is punishing and DMZ has the self-res, but it's almost too generous in squads, the death and respawn mechanic, the way that you have to call the people back in, is a thing of beauty. There's two main elements that make it so interesting to me. One, there's the action that you need to perform. It's a choice on one of your squad mates around like, I have to pause, I have to think through this, and you can even be tactical about it. There's gameplay potential related to it. Like, for example, calling a squad mate in to kill a Biotitan. Two, they attached a resource to it. They made it cost something, and that cost is limited. You can't ever re-up that or increase that number. With that in mind, there's this shared resource that people are using every time someone comes in. The important thing here is the number is generous enough that early on in a deployment, you don't feel bad. Like if you accidentally kill a friend or if you do something funny or something like that, it's okay. You can still bring them back in. It's generous enough in that way, but it still, by the end, has a risk of being really punishing. Losing one of your squad mates and not being able to bring them back in is a huge power drop that you need to then overcome. As opposed to games like Tarkov, where if one of your squad mates die, well, you're alone. Or say DMZ, where if someone dies, you can get them back up with, one of the self-res kits, or there actually are quite a few mechanics in order to res them, which are pretty low lift. It doesn't feel like there's a larger decision to be made there. The constraints applied to the resurrection mechanic in Helldivers make it really well designed. Carrying on from death, let's talk about friendly fire. For a game with such high intensity, explosions and action going on, it's kind of surprising they left friendly fire on, especially for such a PvE friendly game and co-op oriented. It's great that they did though, because it results in a lot of the random hilarity that people love about the game. There's nothing quite like accidentally dropping in as a reinforcement onto one of your squad mates, and it makes it funny. All that said though, they did make some seemingly deliberate design choices to mitigate the impact of friendly fire. Something you probably noticed is that almost all the weapons have traces or lasers that are really visible. It makes it really obvious to see where your squad mates are and if they're over your shoulder firing, and to maybe not step into their line of fire. The call-ins are also really visible, and they all have some clear form of delay at the very beginning to allow people to communicate and say, get out of there. And there are these giant beams of the sky with clear color coding. Red is bad, blue is good. It makes it easier to avoid getting hit. Like if someone does do a deployment or like a call in a specific location where you are, you know it pretty quickly. It makes it easy to be aware of where your allies are. Something else I found really interesting was how enemies don't drop any loot or give XP. So let's talk about that one next. Typically, creatures would drop loot, right? Like it's a game where there's tons of creatures out there, killing them would give you some sort of reward. It's what you'd want to do. Otherwise, it kind of risks people not having a real reason to kill the enemies. That's the potential downside, but the upside here is that you don't feel like you need to kill everything. It doesn't risk forcing the player to go into a big pack of enemies in order to collect a piece of loot. And there's a lot of control on elements like health and ammunition. If enemies dropped ammunition, which would probably be a pretty clear reward for killing the bugs, it could dramatically change up the pace of the game. It could risk allowing for this pretty severe imbalance where players have too much ammunition and resupply abilities like call-ins or the backpacks that you can use become severely devalued. Instead, the loot is at very clear locations around the map. It keeps you moving around and looking for it. On the topic of loot, I love how the loot is always shared. This is a really friendly social mechanic. When one person grabs a sample and a metal or something like that, everyone that extracts, everyone gets that item. So then you're not competing against each other, or in worst case, shooting each other for samples. In Helldivers, the enemies are much more used, instead of being ways to acquire items or XP, they're used to create and apply this constant pressure and keep players moving around the map. They add to the sense of urgency or appropriate challenge to key moments and objectives. You could, in theory, go the entire mission without killing a single non-objective related enemy and still be equally rewarded. This next one is something that they brought forward from Helldivers, the first one, but I think it has a bigger impact here. Every time you call in something from your destroyer, a stratagem, you actually have to pause and you use a different skill. Up until this moment, you've just been shooting and killing bugs and running and doing a lot of very kinetic stuff. When you call in a stratagem, you have to pause, and you're doing this up, down, left, right puzzle game. It forces your brain into a different activity. It makes you think. If this was just open a list, select and throw the grenade, you would do it basically on cooldown because the barrier is really so low. It's this other skill vector that players get to practice and improve over time. And it's really clever, integrating the two of those very disparate types of gameplay into such close interactions. On top of all this, so many of the design decisions that they make favor the player. Whenever you're doing design, it's basically a lot of different decisions that you get to make every day. What happens when this happens? What happens in this edge case? You can see that in the case of Helldivers, they just always tended to err on the favor of the player. You can see this, reinforcing drop pods to kill a Bile Titan. There's a good chance that at some point a designer was like, but that's really imbalanced. So they fell back on like, yeah, but it's better for the player. Other things like making the player protected as soon as they get into the escape ship. Or if you die in solo, you're just brought straight back in. These are all these indicators of small decisions that were made during development that ended up just favoring the player. And it works out really well. Okay, so we've talked about the missions and a lot of the rewards. Now let's talk about kind of everything else. To start with, progression. Honestly, there's so much to go into here that it would pretty much require its own video. So I'm just gonna kind of cover the top points because there's just so much progression. Let's start with the character. There's only really 2 that I've noticed. There could be more. I haven't played for that long, so if I'm wrong here, please do let me know. But most of it comes down to armor and weapons. I'll get to stratagems in a bit. The armor is pretty straightforward. There's not a lot of depth there, and I think that's good. If there was too many choices there, there'd be too much min-maxing, and I don't really think that's what you should be doing, because most of your power doesn't come from that. Most of the power from the armor that I've seen is really just stamina. Beyond that, it doesn't really matter that much. Once you get into the higher levels of progression, the armor value, once you take a hit, you're taking a hit. You're not really like mitigating that much. The weapons, of course, play a pretty big role, and there are clearly ones that are more valuable against certain enemies versus others. So that is a valuable choice, but that's also probably the most impactful choice. Next, stratagems. That's where most of the power is. Like I said, almost all of your power comes from the call-ins that you make. So that progression tree is extremely deep and rich. Though they're limited with cooldowns, the call-ins allow you to kill big bugs. They also lean themselves to some of the really big moments in the game. This actually summarizes really well how I feel about Helldivers progression and why I think it's so good, because it's really impactful. The choices that you make, the ones that really matter, all have a very visceral, meaningful, visual relationship to what's happening in the game. Very rarely are you doing a Destiny style like minor gear score upgrade. More often than not, you're asking yourself, do I want a giant death laser from the sky, or do I want ships flying in and bombing the living hell out of my enemies? Those are really cool choices to make. Of course, when the player makes their choices on how to gear their character is important as well. When do they pick all of this gear, all of the call-ins? They do it just before they load into the mission, when it's most necessary. You tend to customize your choices, especially in the higher difficulties, based on who your squad mates are, what mission type it is, what enemy type it is, and all those factors come into it and make you feel smart. Especially early on, those choices aren't critical. Most of the time, you can get away with making kind of a bad choice and just, you can err in favor of what you prefer to do as a player. Like if you prefer to have a big machine gun, okay, cool. It's probably not gonna make that much of a difference. Only once you get into the really higher difficulties does it make that much of a difference. And even then, the impact is a little fuzzy. In a lot of ways, again, this is erring in the favor of the player, letting them kind of kit out how they want. Generally, how players progress is grind, and that's fine. The more you play, the more regularly you play, the more you contribute, and the higher difficulty all contribute to faster, more progression. It's not something where you have to necessarily overcome challenges. I will say there are a couple of things like the samples that require to dip into the much higher difficulties. I haven't seen any of the higher difficulty samples existing in some of the lower difficulties, even at a very rare basis. So there is a bit of a, you have to get better in order to progress to the full amount, which is a little harder on the player, but it doesn't seem like it's completely impossible. So again, this is progression based on somewhat just commitment and efficiency, as opposed to overcoming challenge. This is actually important for this kind of game because you shouldn't feel like you hit a wall. It's actually something we learned about Diablo. When we first shipped it, honestly, we thought it was a bit more about challenge than it was about efficiency, but we learned really quickly that just results in people getting frustrated, table flipping, and quitting the game. Now, it's okay for a player to leave your game, but you want them to feel like they want to come back. They never want to leave with such a bad taste in their mouth. And this efficiency over challenge thing, especially in a PvE game, contributes to the feeling of like, well, if I just had spent more time doing it, I probably would have gotten further. Next, let's talk about the live service, or the bigger picture, the big campaign part of it. Because I think they've nailed it. Out of all the live service games that I've seen lately, Helldivers 2 feels like it really deserves, it should have a live service, the way that they've set it up. It doesn't feel like it's ham-fisted. It feels like the game is better because it has a live service product attached to it. So when I say necessary, I mean it's actually like contributing to the overall element of the design. I read a post on LinkedIn recently from one of the design directors where he talks about the story is being told through that live service. Whenever players are contributing to a world, mission, something like that, that's telling the story of the world. That's a really good way to leverage live service. It also creates that top level umbrella for motivations for a lot of the things that you do. The daily missions feel like they feed back up into this. The campaign missions, the longer term ones, they're like receiving orders from a general saying, we need more effort over here, go send your troops over here. These all feed up into this broader story. Again, it makes the live service feel like it's a necessity and not just something that's bootstrapped on top of it. If you've ever played a campaign with a group of friends in some sort of tabletop game or D&D, something like that, it feels like this. It feels like there's this longer term thing happening which stitches all of your actions together. With the map and choosing your deployment location and each of those deployment locations and missions feeling like they're contributing to this bigger battle, all of your actions feel more meaningful. It helps you foresee the future. It helps you feel like it's going somewhere. There's this promise there. Emotionally, this just hits very different to saying season 1, season 2, season 3, season 4. From a developer perspective, they may well see it as seasons, but from the player's perspective, they see it as the first part of a massive campaign in order to save Super Earth from the Tyranids. The downside to this is that your contributions don't feel as meaningful because the percentage values are so high. whenever you complete a mission, your actual impact there is infinitesimal because there's 500,000 people playing at the same time and they could also be contributing to that mission. Of course, we haven't seen where this is going yet. It may turn into something where there are these pivotal moments where you breach the front. They've just mentioned that they're going to be having these large story narrative beats that pull forward. So we'll have to see how this plays out. This may actually get completely mitigated when those big moments come across because you're like, I was a part of that. I really drove forward to that. And given how good they've delivered everything else, I have pretty high hopes they'll be able to pull off a connection between my actions and the actions that happened in the bigger war. I hate the term monetization. I actually think it's been leveraged as more of exploitation than monetization. Don't get me wrong, monetization is fine. I don't mind giving people money for content that I have no problem engaging in and I'm getting a lot of value out of. And that's why I don't mind writing this here about Helldivers. I feel like every time I spend money on that game, it doesn't feel like I'm being exploited. It feels like I'm making a choice to support the developer. And that's a critical difference. This is not all of it, by the way. I'm sure that there's so much more depth that we could get into here that I just haven't had the opportunity to. And honestly, I haven't played enough of the game in order to get there yet. The big takeaway for me is that Helldivers really feels like an extraction game. It clearly appeals to a broad audience, and honestly, it just further reinforces my belief that we're in the midst of seeing a wave of extraction games appear. Now, if you'd like to learn more about the design of extraction games in detail, you can check out this video here where I super deep dive into the whole thing. For now though, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.